Welcome back. Today we are joined by Professor Richard Sakwa, professor at the University of Kent, and I would add the greatest scholar we have on Russian politics here in Europe. So the purpose, of course, today is to discuss his book, The Lost Peace, but also the consequence of this, which would be Russia's pivot to the east. So welcome back to the program.
It's my pleasure to be back.
So I thought that a good place to start regarding your book, The Lost Peace, would be in 1989 when the Cold War was declared to be over. A new Europe was to be created without dividing lines, instead based on indivisible security and sovereign equality, which was hoped to end the ideological rivalry and bloc politics, more or less along the lines of Gorbachev's concept of a common European home. I I guess, what were the main expectations back then, and why did it develop in a very different direction? Or to borrow the title of your book, why was the peace lost?
Yeah. Thanks. I actually do argue that there was a peace to be lost, a potential peace. And what sort of peace? Well, the real argument would be we should begin not so much in 1989, but in 1945. And actually, as we talk now, we are celebrating the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations. And of course, at the end of the Second World War, the most devastating war in human history, those aspirations which went towards establishing the United Nations and the adoption of the Charter and all the other protocols, institutions, and so on that came later, was an attempt precisely to establish a positive peace order, not just the absence of war, but for humanity to avoid the scourge of war, as the Charter says. So in 1945, the great powers, and indeed other powers, China, India was a founder member, even though it wasn't independent in 1945, and so on, came together. But to understand, the deep aspect of your question, let me just suggest that what was going on in 1945 was and why the Charter International System, as I call it, has lasted 80 years. Though some people would say it's barely hanging on now. We can maybe talk about United Nations in a minute, but where it is after 80 years. But nevertheless, in 1945, two things came together to establish this Charter International System. The first was the idea that that the great powers would have a special place. The League of Nations failed because it didn't have this equivalent to a Security Council. So we had, the way I nowadays describe it is that two forms of comity. It's a great word which I nowadays use, C-O-M-I-T-Y, comity, came together. Comity is defined as when nations come together for a common purpose. So in 1945, two forms of comity. The first one was Great Power Comity, which the Russians and the Soviets before then used to call the Yalta-Potsdam system, though it wasn't really a Yalta-Potsdam system, but it certainly meant that the United Nations incorporated the great power and the great powers. And that was one of the conditions why the United States joined and why the Senate, which of course didn't ratify the League of Nations Treaty in 1919, did in 1945. So, Great Power Comity, now in the Security Council, the 5 permanent members. The second type of comity is Federative Comity. Today, 193 equal sovereign states in the United Nations General Assembly. As we talk, it's meeting for its 80th session to celebrate the 80th anniversary. Federative, or if you like, how can I put it, Democratic Comity, which is that all states have equal sovereignty and such like. So this is a charter system, and it survived because of this combination of the aspirations of equality of all nation states and the great power politics. Well, coming back to 1989, when Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, put an end to the Cold War with the Soviet Union in the lead, he did not. It was not a capitulation to the West, the political West, as I call it, the collective West, as the Russians call it. It was precisely an attempt to go back to the charter system. He said it explicitly thousands of times, in his famous United Nations speech in December 1988 and many other occasions, we need to go back to 1945. And those principles, those charter ideas of human dignity, national sovereignty, and sovereign internationalism, and so on, that was on the agenda. That was an attempt to reboot the system. And why did it fail? It failed because the political West, or that collective West, basically sought to appropriate or to block the alternative, to block this genuine going back to 1945, and instead, not even Great Power Committee, but a unipolar, unipower system reasserted itself in the form of US hegemony for the next decade or two. That is why it was lost. And then the epiphenomenon of that, of course, NATO enlargement, the complete collapse of European security order. The idea was that this post-Cold War system would simply be the expansion of the political West, claiming to be universal, which obviously Russia, China, and some other states would never be able to accept. And that's why then we, in some sense, as you could say, the Cold War never ended, and it was just took new forms, and of course today exceptionally dangerous forms.
So the Cold War, well, from the Second World War, you would see that the West more or less lived in a dual system then, because we did have the, I guess, the transatlantic system of the political West, but at the same time, the, I guess, institutions it framed around the United Nations. So, one hand we have the bloc system of political West, and on the other there is this more inclusive international system, which international law is anchored in. But is this how you see the main competition then being between the West and the Russians after the Cold War? That is, which world to embrace, either the UN system of inclusive sovereign equals, or just an expanded West where the West would have this, I guess, privileges.
Exactly. The way I see it is that we live, and since 1945, we have, if you will, let's not even say the top level, but in domains of international affairs, we have the international system, the Charter, which is the only source, by the way, as you say, of international law, genuine international humanitarian law, and indeed of the only legitimate authority for more than universal sanctions and so on. But within this international system, we had and have visions of global world orders contending. We had the Soviet bloc, as you say, the Soviet-led, Russian-led Soviet bloc. And on the other side, we had this collective West, the Atlantic power system, the political West. Yeah, after 1989, one bloc, the Warsaw Pact, dissolved, but at that moment, this political West radicalized. It claimed to be universal, and this political West was generated and always had, by the way, a different vision, a model of how international politics works, which was antagonistic to how the charter system it should work. At the foundation of the charter system is the principle of sovereign internationalism. And that's why people like John Eikenberry and others, great defenders of the so-called liberal international order, are mistaken in saying that today we're going back to Westphalia of just, these sovereign states like billiard balls bashing against each other, because sovereign internationalism is Westphalia plus. Sovereignty plus internationalism in many forms, but above all, and the United Nations. Whereas the ideology of this Atlantic system, of the political West, was and always was and is liberal globalism. John Mearsheimer calls it liberal hegemony after 1989, but liberal globalism. In other words, that there were things above and higher than national sovereignty. And that's why the United States, during the first Cold War, intervened 55 times with various types of coups or interventions, even when democratically powers, for example, Chile in 1973. So, but as liberal globalism then, of course, radicalized after 1989 in the absence of this competing world order, which Then it became, so-called rules-based order, liberal hegemony, and so on, which of course is now being challenged by the more and more delineated new model of world order, alternative one, which is the Russo-Chinese alignment, or BRICS, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a whole stack, which in general terms we could call, well, let's call it, I don't know what to call it, the political East. But it's important to stress that this political East, just like Gorbachev, is not anti-Western. It is, or even anti-blue, it is post-Western. It is appealing not to, be the anti of something or other. It is the counter of the logic of liberal globalism, and it's defending sovereign internationalism, and therefore it is appealing again to the Charter principles. And that's what makes this, where we live today, unless we enter into full-scale war, so interesting, is that we now have a global force led by, with all of their flaws, Russia and China and India and Brazil and so many other countries. Indonesia joined the BRICS organization this year. In other words, to defend precisely Charter principles. And that's the key thing.
Whenever I speak to some American officials who had a role in constructing the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe, they always make the point, much like John Mersheimer, that the principal thought was that this was going to be a force for good. Again, that the good intentions were essentially genuine. The idea that they could recreate the world in their image of one organized around U.S. hegemony and liberal democratic values was supposed to be something not aimed against someone. It was supposed to be a force for good, something and everyone would benefit in. Of course, one can argue that this married into the whole neocon project of peace through dominance. But irrespective of that, it seems that often the negative Russian reaction to this is framed in terms of the values. So if we then pursue this international system based on liberal hegemony, the argument is that the Russians were fearful of democracy. They didn't like to see democracy because, they're inherently authoritarian. Along those kind of lines, often intended to demonize the Russians. But while the Russians always focused on the hegemonic aspect, that they didn't care for the sovereign inequality, the idea that all decisions were simply going to be made in Washington and the rest of the world had to adjust. But when do you think, in this timeline between 89 and the present time, when was it that we effectively began losing the peace? Or do you see it as many different steps? Or how, again, from the great optimism from the 90s when we thought this would be a force for good, how did we end up in this situation where we're now more or less calling for striking Moscow with missiles? It's obviously the peace has been lost, but do you have any, not bookmarks, but points in history where we obviously made some key mistakes?
Well, I mean, I suppose, to be absolutely accurate, we never did get the peace that we wanted. So when we say it was a lost peace, we never really had it. But the peace that the peace that was lost was a positive peace, as opposed to the negative peace of Cold War. But yes, there is a very clear timeline. But to go back to your earlier point before going to that, just to say that absolutely after 1945, the United States-led political West certainly had this double face. And the way I would describe it today, I mean, not just me, I suppose, but to say that these two faces were empire and Commonwealth. So the fact that US, Anglo-America, until 1947, when the United States in the Greek Civil War handed over the baton to the US to lead the West, that it did have a very powerful Commonwealth perspective, the public good, common goods, and so on. And this is, of course, the ideology on which the Cold War was fought. And it was not empty. It was them. They were genuine, obviously, many good elements in this political West. That's why I'm saying, and this was a Commonwealth, the public goods. Well, let's not even talk about globalization, but the two other major domains of international politics. We have the international system, if you like, the top level, competing world orders, and then, of course, we have the international political economy level. And at that level, the United States delivered many public goods in establishing a framework for world trade and world economic development, which has been unparalleled in human history. And of course, just to say a fourth domain for the sake of completeness, is that it was also a time of huge burgeoning transnational civil society, international non-governmental organizations, Oxfam, Amnesty International, and so many others doing so much important work. So empire versus Commonwealth. The other side, of course, was empire. US will remain number one. Anybody which challenges, even democratically, communists in Italy in 1976, 1949, elsewhere, Chile, anywhere else, it was empire. I mean, let's call it, it's a symbolic, but let's call it the empire. After 1989, the Commonwealth element was going to continue, clearly, but it radicalized in all sorts of ways because the timeline at that moment was the 40 years after 1945 were dominated by, well, the contest with the Soviet Union, which forced the Western powers to adopt Keynesianism, establishing welfare states. Of course, it began before the war with the New Deal in the United States and Swedish, Scandinavian social democracy before the war. But it then became a general mode, United Kingdom, France, Italy, and so on, Germany. So 40 years they were building, that they were modifying, tempering, weakening the capitalism blue in tooth and claw. But then we spent, after 1985, already the socialist challenge was beginning to, was weakening, so not just the Soviet Union in its geopolitical form, but internally. And we've spent the last 40 years dismantling the taming of capitalism under the guise of neoliberalism, and of course, in foreign policy, a radicalized neoconservative vision of permanent US dominance, hegemony. So the turning point is, within that intellectual framework, that the 1990s, of course, saw radical form of free market liberalism in Russia, post-communist states, and of course, generating conflicts within the political West, within the societies of the political West, that have now are opening up a whole new phase of what are called left and right populist challenges, and so on. So when you say the moments, of course, then within that we have, of course, this undertow of, in the political West, of vis-a-vis in our European context, the enlargement of NATO, the inability of the United States to act as a genuine peacemaker. We can see this already in the Yugoslav civil wars, or Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, the bombing of Yugoslavia, Serbia in 1999, and of course the illegal Anglo-American invasion of 2003, the US withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in June 2002. So there's lots of moments on this path, which of course was an accumulating security dilemma on the European continent, which exploded in the terrible war, which we now see, Russia-Ukrainian war. So there's all sorts of steps, but each step was within this logic which I suggested earlier.
It is, what is interesting though is often this debate. Well, I get the impression there's a lot of similarities to the 19th century, because in those days you had among the British liberals, you had some arguing for and against the concept of a liberal empire. That is, some liberals argued that an empire contradicted the idea of liberalism, that is, self-determination of a people. While others, you could put John Stuart Mill in that category, argued that empire was required in order to advance the cause of liberalism. So again, is liberalism, does it contradict the concept of empire? There was a dispute between this. But of course, after the economic crisis of 1873, one saw that the whole concept of empire became, well, it abandoned the pretense of advancing liberalism to a large extent. It became a bit uglier, more extractive, and more ruthless in the geopolitical competition. Now, if you look at, well, we don't call it liberal empire today, we call it liberal hegemony, but again, it feels like a rebranding to some extent. But the same discussions more or less is built into this. That is it the people supporting it, arguing essentially then for the value then of interfering in domestic affairs of other countries to promote democracy, humanitarian interventionism, expanding these exclusive blocks, that this is all in support of liberal democracy. Again, this is the logic behind expanding the EU and NATO as opposed to having some inclusive security architecture focused on mitigating security competition. But do you see some of this falling apart a bit like in the late 19th century as well, the pretense of serving some higher goals? Because when you see the political West today, it doesn't have the same, at least altruistic intent as it had in the 1990s. At least then you saw some genuine belief in it. But as we now boycott diplomacy, engage in genocide, in at least complicit to some extent in the genocide in Gaza, it doesn't feel like the ideological arguments behind it is as profound as it was back then. Indeed, we seem to be legitimizing a lot of our actions more and more by more traditional bloc politics as opposed to being about the advancement of liberal democracy.
Yeah. For ending the final point, is that double standards are built into a system which has these two logical operative systems of empire and Commonwealth, the public good, and you can never. Therefore, the emperor is always going to defend itself, and when it's going cruising along nicely, unchallenged, it can show its benign face. But as soon as a challenge emerges, you have the tougher face. And double standards, of course, you're friendly or selective, imposing. You're soft to your friends and harsh to your enemies, using precisely the normative values, or in the 19th century, they would call it the values of civilization, and the civilization standards were going to work. So double standards isn't an accident. It's absolutely inherent to what's going on. But you're absolutely right. This liberal imperialism of the 19th century took the form, in my view, the way my terminology, after 1945, of liberal globalism. Precisely those same arguments. And if I could step back for 1 second, and just to say that, which makes it interesting, is that we are dealing with, which makes our analysis a little bit more complicated, is that we're dealing with three types of West, if you like, three Wests. There's this beast, which I call the political West after 1945, the Atlantic power system, US-led, two faces, the imperial and the Commonwealth, and it has this genuine public goods. Absolutely, I defend a better West in that, of course, the human rights, the freedoms, the classical standards of high modernity, and so on. How this political West. Then you have the second West. This is what precisely what you've just referred to, the civilizational West. Alan Freeman, just our political thinker, former advisor to the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, describes it as the Columbian West from 1492, after Columbus went to the United States, went to the Americas, and this dominance of European civilization, with all of its catastrophic consequences globally, and also the spreading of high cultures, obviously, and a technological culture is complicated. But this is another interesting moment we're coming to reckon with. We're dealing with the legacy of the political West, its rise and its relative decline today. And in its decline, it's becoming more, if you like, more aggressive and more less of the double standards and more the single standard of dominance and hegemony, as you point out was the case with the new imperialism from the late 1870s, in particular the 1880s, and when the Western European powers, fought openly, and the United States joined in 1898. So, but we're coming to terms now with 500 years of the dominance of European civilization on a global level. As we know, one of our colleagues, Sergei Karaganov in Russia, is writing a lot about this, one of the leaders, organizers of the Valdau Club, who has been arguing that this dominance of the West, he sometimes uses 500 years, sometimes 300 years, but is coming to an end. So we have the double crisis of the political West after 1945, of the civilizational West, and the rest of the world is also coming to terms with it. And we saw this spectacularly in the rapprochement Russia, China, and India holding hands in Beijing at the, in Tianjin at the BRICS summit, Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, on the last day of August and the first day of September this year. Can I just say this? There is the third West. This is the cultural West. This is the one, going back to Greco-Roman, Babylonian culture. This is the one Judeo-Christian. It's at the core of it. And in this cultural West, Russia, for example, is a founder member. It's an intrinsic part of it. It's also this cultural West was always open. I mentioned Babylonia and Persia, and Indus and the Sinaic civilizations. So there's a whole slew of books published in the English language recently about the West. And that's interesting because this is precisely, they're saying, well, what is this beast, this West, which we're talking about, and clearly the slew of books now are an attempt to come to terms with this, 2,500 year, 3,000 year history. When I mentioned this, they're Chinese. Well, they say it's still relatively new then, because they have a 5,000 year history of cultural, some sort of formation. But yes, so again, so there's lots of things coming together at this moment, which makes it, very exciting intellectually. If only we can get a conceptual grasp of these multiple layers and multiple, it's easy to use the word crisis, but certainly, the Greek word crisis means a moment of reflection in the life of the community, and that's what we're doing, is reflecting, and it's fascinating to do so, though with those huge dangers which we've identified.
Oh, I like that's a nicer way of looking at crisis, a more helpful one as well. I want to address this pivot to the east, which you mentioned. Obviously, the meeting in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization became a good indication of this, but a lot of the reasoning behind this, the Russian abandonment of Greater Europe, it became to a large extent the consequence of the coup in 2014 in Ukraine, because for the Russians they had more or less preserved Gorbachev's idea of a common European home in different formats. But even Putin wanted what is often referred to as a Greater Europe. But the problem always with NATO expansion, also recognized in the 1990s, was there would be no logical stop for it. Where would it stop before reaching Ukraine? And more or less, it seemed a lot, or if not most people, recognized that this would be deeply problematic. And that became the very important year of 2014, when the government in Ukraine was toppled with the support of the West, because the Russians seemed to think that this was, it became evidence that there would be no gradual integration of Russia. Instead, Ukraine would be, built as a wall or a front line against Russia. And this is when the Russians seemed to abandon this dream of Greater Europe and replaced it with what they now refer to as Greater Eurasia. Now, I agree with you. I don't think this Greater Eurasia concept is aimed against the West as a bloc along the lines of the Cold War, but rather, I think, simply creating a post-Western world where the West is not against the West, but it's not as Western-centric as it was in the past. Now, I wanted to ask about what the implications are for Europe, because it was only Russia wanting to look to the east. It could be another Primakov moment. But again, this is a very different time in history. In 2013, the Chinese had announced this Belt and Road Initiative. By 2015, they had announced their objective to take leadership in key technologies with the China 2025 initiative. This 2015 is also when they launched this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which became one of many efforts to claim a greater role in forming international finance. So you then had 2014, the Russians losing all hope in a common future in Europe. And at the same time, you have then China rising up to create some economic alternatives to the US-centered international economic system. And together, they seem to have formed some gravitational pull, which has begun to reshape Eurasia. Now, in lieu of all this, how is this affecting Europe? Because the whole decision of not creating an inclusive system with the Russians was premised on liberal hegemony, but hegemony is no longer an option. So how does this unavoidably create a new Cold War, or how are you assessing, I guess, Russia's position in Europe's position in this greater Eurasia? A year ago, I asked Putin about this at the Valdai discussion meeting, and I'm still looking for some good answers. What could be a way of harmonizing the initiatives without being in direct conflict?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right that we're talking about the emergence of an increasingly post-Western world orders, or even an international system with declining dominance of the political West, and indeed declining dominance of the civilizational West as we come to terms with our own background. Hopefully our cultural West will survive and thrive. But to go to a specific thing, it is hubris. Jonathan Haslam's got an excellent book called Hubris on the background to the Russo-Ukrainian war. And it really was. It was just one step after another. You asked earlier about the staging posts. Well, we could go through it and we could add to that list a whole stack of things, including the attempts to build an anti-ballistic missile system in Eastern Europe, with there's now 2 items in Poland and Romania, and just on and on and on, the intervention in Libya. But can I just say, in the terms of all of this greater European idea, even Zbigniew Brzezinski, the great passionate, ardent enthusiast for NATO enlargement, in his book of 1997, much misquoted, but The Grand Chessboard, he did say he wanted NATO enlargement, but he did say at some point, I've forgotten what page number, he actually said, of course, this can only take place within the framework of a larger pan-European security framework with Russia. So even he and later on he developed that idea even more, virulently anti-Russian and so on. And of course with William Burns, George Kennan and so on, who made similar arguments. So Europe, in other words, failed to take control of its own destiny. That this logic of expansion was driven by Washington. Of course, there was a demand for it from the former communist countries in Eastern Europe, but a demand generated, of course, in large part because of the absence of a coherent alternative. And you can understand why they'd want to join NATO, which was the only thing on offer. When there was the Partnership for Peace, if the not the Council of Europe, but if the OSCE, Organization for Security and Conference in Europe, could have developed as an alternative, then the game would have been more complicated. But as it is, it expanded. And of course, it generated, as you say, endless tensions, endless conflict, and ended up where we are. But the deeper thing is, as I say, after 1989, Europe failed to disengage itself from the political West. So NATO enlargement wasn't just about bringing in Eastern Europe or enlarging. It was also a way of maintaining US hegemony over Western Europe itself. Quite explicitly, actually. I've just recently been looking into this question. In Bosnia, when, if you remember, in 1990-91, this Luxembourg politician said, "This is the hour of Europe has struck." And in the first year, 91-92, Europe says to Washington, "Keep out of it. This is our backyard. We'll deal with this." And of course, the United States then Germany did premature recognition of Croatia, didn't help. But the Europeans ultimately were unable to deal with it. US deliberately then comes in, blocks what was earlier versions, the Badinter and earlier plan of Vanso and in Bosnia. Anyway, we could go into all this detail, but bottom line was that after 1989, it wasn't just, we keep talking about NATO enlargement. It was the mere fact of NATO remaining was a way of ensuring that the United States, the European states, remain subaltern or vassal states, as some people call it, and so on. And the result is today that this overextension hitting the rock of Ukraine war over there, on which the European project will founder, because quite clearly they've met more or less a solid object, which is Russian resistance to this expansion, and of course this out of this collision, catastrophic, which we're seeing now. Of course, the escalation of incidents, so-called Russian infringements, drone in Poland, flights in the Baltic, in Romania, etc. So the political West, the mere fact that it continued after 1989 meant that Europe couldn't take control of its own destiny. Emmanuel Macron, when he first came into power as president of France in 2017 and soon afterwards, made some splendid speeches precisely on this issue. It was called strategic autonomy and all the rest. It failed. So what do we have today? We have, as a result of the Russo-Ukrainian war, we have the NATOization of the European Union. So as I say, it wasn't just about expansion. It was about deepening NATO within the very heart of the European political project, which means it is no longer a peace project, insofar as it ever was, the European Union. It has become a war project, as we've seen now. Catastrophic outcomes, and of course, with huge economic difficulties. The energy costs are 3 times higher than they were before the war, because cheap Russian gas is no longer available. And it's worse. I mean, the Commission under Ursula von der Leyen is on a suicidal path to destroy the European economies because of the intensity of the virulence of their Russophobia. It's become a pathology, as we know, with Kaja Kallas as the Foreign Affairs Commissioner, Kublias in the military, Friedrich Merz in Germany, who is, again, something quite astonishing. So Europe is on a path of self-destruction. Meanwhile, as you say, the rest of the world is looking on and looking, as the global north fragments and even the political West is declining because it had those two aspects, the Commonwealth and the empire, and is now simply becoming empire. As you say, late 19th century, where it sheds its illusions. Elsewhere I describe it as the curtain is drawn, because the power system behind all these nice words was, behind a veil, and now that veil has gone. And we can see that Trumpian America, Starmerite Britain, Merzian Germany, Macronist France, these are just virulently militarizing states, which do not even, apart from Trump, they do not even consider the concept of peace, negotiation, and diplomacy to end this dreadful war on our continent. Anyway, in all of that, we have indeed the emergence of an alternative, Greater Europe. But as you say, what is this Greater Eurasian project? Where does it begin? Where does it end? What political forms will it take? What institutional forms will it take? It's a work in progress, people would say. And that's why I said, do we call it the Northern Eurasian element, because that's obviously the Northern Eurasian states, China, Russia. Do we call it the Global East, or of course allied with the Global South, which many countries there are balancing, bandwagoning, and all that classical debates about that. So, but in some ways, we're back to great power conflict. And so we're back to, indeed, to a late 19th century moment. And we know how that ended in the First World War. And the whole point of the Charter International System was to avert going back to a 1914 or 1939. But unfortunately, we're heading precipitously towards that denouement unless we, as intellectuals, as peace movements, other movements, if we can have a countervailing force. And we see that, I suppose. Just one final point, in touch on what you say. As you say, it isn't anti-Western. This word is very important to say. It's counter the logic of the politics at the heart of the political West, which is always competitive, lose, win, and so on. And obviously, Trump is the epitome of that. Whereas many people criticize the Chinese win-win philosophy, but it rather appeals to me. It's let's make it work. Let's change the dynamics of international politics. And it's so catastrophic facing, we've got so many technological, exciting developments. I'm excited by small modular reactors. It could develop parts of Asia, parts of Africa, the Arctic, where it's difficult to get electricity. We can improve. Humanity can do so much. And instead of which, if I may say so, those backward-looking political elites in Washington and Brussels and Warsaw and London and Berlin, and the list, I'm afraid, is quite even longer than that, are looking to a stage, an anachronistic, archaic form of politics, which in 1945, for a brief moment, in 1989, a second moment, we really thought we could transcend.
It is Chinese, win-win. They call the Shanghai spirit as well. It shouldn't be that alien. That's kind of the key principle of the indivisible security, of which is what's supposed to be the recipe for overcoming, or at least mitigating some of the security competition in the international system. So that is kind of the solution we should have been aiming for. It just seems like in the West we do have some problem with the adjusting to the post-hegemonic moment, because this is the end of a 500-year long moment. So I don't hear enough of this in terms of how is it possible for us to, as the political West, to harmonize our interest with other great powers which are not Western. In other words, what does the world look like where we are no longer dominant? Because this is simply the reality, and I think a lot of the conflicts we have derive from the reluctance to adjust to this reality. Instead, all security initiatives seems organized around the idea of how do we go back, restore the hegemonic era. So how do we break the Russians, break the Chinese? Whatever. I just had a comment on the Macron issue, because what is fascinating with him is he actually warned years ago that the Europeans, we should not become vassals of the United States. And he also recognized that the Europeans had to find a role for Russia in Europe, that we couldn't simply create a Europe without the Russians. And these two issues were tied together, because if we don't have a role for Russia in Europe, we're going to have conflicts. If we have conflicts, that means we will be more dependent on the United States for security if we revive the Cold War logic. And in such a situation, this whole goal of creating an independent position for Europe, autonomous from the United States, would be undermined, because what changed in the early 90s is we didn't have this excessive dependence on US security, which the Americans could then use to extract political and economic concessions from the Europeans. Again, a very asymmetrical relationship, but instead, the Europeans have done exactly the opposite. They got into this Ukraine war, this conflict with Russia, and as a result, a very predictable thing happened. The Europeans got cut off from Russia, some on their own. Of course, the destruction of Nord Stream assisted the severing of economic ties, but also they got along on now the snapback sanctions on Iran, cut themselves off that, and now China as well, being pressured by the Americans to put more sanctions on China, cutting ties there. Even India has to be pressured and alienated. Now, the problem then, of course, is the Europeans only create more dependence on the United States as the only game in town. And this allows the US to become even more abusive, if you will, or extractive in its relationship. It just doesn't seem like the political West can last for much longer in such an unequal partnership between I wouldn't say master and a slave, but at least it's not an equal relationship anymore. And yet the Europeans do not seem to address this problem. Instead, they seem to push for more conflict with Russia and to get the US deeper involved. I'm not sure, how you see this. I mean, I would also like to see preservation of the cultural West. And I'm a bit concerned when I hear in Russia that done with the West altogether. I would have liked to see, some some efforts to still revive some of the ties with the cultural West, even though they have, seem to have had enough of Europe at the moment, at least in the rhetoric.
Yeah. Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German unification, and in the late 19th century, after that, he said, the secret of a successful foreign policy is a good treaty with Moscow, with Russia. And I think that principle holds as much in the 1870s and today. So that is the secret, and it would have been the secret all the way through. So you're absolutely right. What has unfortunately happened is that Washington, the United States, was too successful in NATOizing Europe. And now, even if the United States itself was beginning to move, and obviously Trump is moving beyond NATO, he's very ambivalent about it. And of course, the United States itself is now defecting from the political West. It's using it, as you say, instrumentally. It's bullying its allies as much as its alleged adversaries and opponents. So it's raw power. And the West seems to be taking it, and it's willing to sacrifice good relations with India and China. At the moment, there's a debate going on about that in pursuit of policies, again, generated through Washington's concerns. So, and the political West, and the way I look at this Trumpian phenomenon, which of course intersects with all of these things, is that Trump himself is interesting because the first, I mean, I now like this look at it, is that Trump has done, is leading basically 4 defections, leaving. The first one, he's leaving the political West. MAGA, it's all about this. America first, make America great again. We don't need these Western European allies. They've been a burden to us, and so on and so forth. If you want us anything from the US, you have to pay for it. And if you want to continue the war in Ukraine, you pay for it. We'll give you weapons, but you pay for it. And you take responsibility for it. So the political West is splitting now. But this defection, you could say this Trumpian one, was welcome across the whole spectrum of left-wing and peacenik people could say, yeah, it's time. This NATO established for a purpose. It should have been dissolved 40 years ago. But the second defection is more concerning about the United States because it's defecting also from the international system, from the Charter of the United Nations. As we know, the United States is not paying, and it hasn't done for many years, including under Biden, its full whack for the United Nations for the costs. And in fact, it's this year, it's only paid 1/3 of its money. By the way, China is not up to date of paying its contribution to the United Nations. And that's a point which I think we really ought to make with our Chinese friends. Why doesn't it step in to support the United Nations and its work? As you know, the United Nations has to lose about 500 staff this year alone. So it's very bad. That's the second defection. Of course, the other ones are domestic, US, Trump defecting from the US Constitution, dismantling the administrative state a la Bannon internally, and of course, defecting from the international political economic order, which it established in favor of unilateral sanctions and tariffs and so on. So as for Europe, where does this leave it? As you say, in Russia, almost any academic, intellectual, public thinker in Russia will say, apart from the Eurasianists, that Russia is fundamentally a European state. Now, we know this. I've never been to Vladivostok, but I've been as far as Tomsk and Irkutsk and so on. And these are European societies, thoroughly European. And in many ways, the best of Europe, still continuing social democratic traditions, still continuing welfare state and so on, public benefits. Of course, it's relatively it isn't so wealthy, so it hasn't as developed as it could be. So you're absolutely right. So that Russia is not leaving Europe. It's still going to remain there, and it's not going to be moved away to the Pacific Ocean. Just like United Kingdom, obviously, for many years has wanted to be towed off into the mid-Atlantic so that we don't have those pesky Europeans barking at our heels for so long. Where does this leave Europe? It's the only prognosis we can have is a deeply pessimistic one. imbued by the spirit of militarism, of revanchism, but above all, incompetence. It is incapable of developing a strategy for its own development, for its own politics. It is driven by this virulent Russophobia, so intense, so powerful. You could argue, in other words, that European political culture has become thoroughly Ukrainized. And by that I mean the Ukraine war, of course, is in part a civil war within Ukraine itself. You mentioned the coup of 2014, which disturbed the balance within Ukraine and allowed a very militant, radical nationalist part of the society to defeat and destroy and undermine politically the other part, which then generated a conflict. But that part has now become almost absorbed into European political culture at the same time as Israeli militancy has also been absorbed into European political culture. You know, to this week, and many countries, but the United Kingdom has recognized the Palestinian state, as we've all heard. But the only response is so little, so late, given the fact that mass murder is continuing, genocide, call it what you will, in Gaza. It is, when history books are written, this is the apotheosis, the culmination of the intellectual and strategic bankruptcy of our West European elites, that we were not able to stand up. And as you mentioned, the snapback sanctions on Iran. Just last week, Iran went back to say, yes, we will allow the International Atomic Energy Authority to resume inspections within Iran. Still, these European powers, you think that our elite has gone crazy in some ways. Where's the logic to it? Where's the humanity to it? 90 million people in Iran to suffer, nearly 150 million in Russia. Is there no limit? And of course, sadly, there does appear to be no limit to their intellectual and strategic bankruptcy, and of course, political corruption.
Yeah, I saw the interview with Macron where he recognized, well, the Iranians have opened up the door to IAEA, but are we still going to do the sanctions? I mean, this is really extraordinary stuff. But as you suggest, a key component of geopolitics is the recognition that the geography matters. So obviously Russia will still be here in Europe. But just as a last question, though, I wanted to ask, because your book on the lost peace, it does outline a lot of paths which were not taken. And I guess, yeah, we'll never know what happened with those paths in a different timeline. But what are the paths ahead of us, possible paths, not just there's current ideas being proposed by the European governments. We just said that the president of the Czech Republic suggesting we should start shooting down Russian planes. Another, horrible idea taking us towards World War III. But what are other paths ahead in terms of organizing European security? Because obviously the Russians have made more or less a permanent pivot to Asia. But even in this greater Eurasia construct, Europe is still considered part of it. It's not going to be the possibilities we had in the 1990s. But what are possibilities in terms of how Europe could organize relations with Russia? Because it is, I know the Europeans don't like to hear this often, or at least European leaders, but Russia is the largest country in Europe in terms of land size, in terms of population, military,
economy,
as well as economy. Yeah, they're the fourth largest economy now in terms of purchasing power parity. And this in the middle of a war as well. This is only going to continue to grow. So the whole idea, which European leaders used to recognize, that creating a Europe without Russia would likely become a Europe against Russia. I mean, this is played out as predictable, but what are other paths then? How can we organize European security? Not just, doing Russia any favors, but for ourselves, because this Europe obviously isn't doing very well at all.
Yeah. I like to use the word immanent, not imminent, but immanent. Something, the forces which are within a society which are tending in one way or another, and indeed in international affairs. So in 1945, there was potential. That moment, the 1945 moment, the spirit of 1945, we can call it, was leading towards, okay, we've got to go towards establish this charter system. But of course, at the same time, we had the Cold War was soon afterwards generated. And then, of course, in 1989, that within Russia and indeed with the peace movements in the West, there was a particular push in a certain direction. Today, what are the forces? What are the deep bubbling forces underneath society which would lead to be able to answer your question in this particular moment? And unfortunately, within the political West, or this West which we talk about, it's all deeply negative. There's, we would then say, where's the peace movements? Where are those arguing? There are peace movements. There's plenty. I've been talking to many of these marvelous people, and there is a countervailing forces and brave individuals. In the United States, we have the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which, and many, many others, which are doing good work. In the United Kingdom, unfortunately, there's almost a complete intellectual and institutional bankruptcy in terms of thinking alternative ways. Unfortunately, people would argue it takes a war for the international system, for that moment to change and the imminent forces to emerge out. And of course, in the nuclear age, that war, of course, will be effectively terminal for humanity. Insects may well survive and the cockroaches will thrive. But the countervailing force today is not from within the West, but it is from outside the West, the post-Western, the counter forces, not anti, but the counter forces to the logic of conflict, with all of their contradictions. Russia, China, India, of course, also have work to do internally to make themselves more in conformity with charter ideals. Okay, you feed the people first, and we then move on. Good. That's a reasonable way of doing things. In short, today, deeply negative for our Western societies. Deeply negative. In the United Kingdom, as you know, we have a deeply unpopular government. In France, Macron's got 17%, Labour Party 20%. I mean, it's just incredible how the political elite, the attempt to establish an alternative headed by Corbyn and Zara Sultana in the United Kingdom, called Your Party, has very quickly split. I don't know whether it'll recover. And the ideas and the excitement is on the right. We saw that in the United States with Charlie Kirk. We see that in France with Rassemblement National. And that, of course, may stabilize the situation, but it doesn't provide solutions. So I think that the only prognosis is the only one. But there's no international system or no alternative to the Charter international system, however badly it works. United Nations reform, make the United Nations system work, and let's live up to those principles of 1945.
I just wish there would be some good indications of some political giants of our time who are ready to do the proper diplomacy and at least propose something. But instead, we have leaders with nothing, and we see that they are isolating themselves and their countries internationally. They're getting deeper involved in several wars, overseeing this economic decline, and also as a consequence, so it's suffering through a crisis now of political legitimacy, as you correctly said. They don't have any support, significant support, and the reaction appears to be to instead go after political opposition, as you see now in many European countries. It's again, I would have liked to see an orderly transition into this multipolar system, but it appears that the Europeans seems intent on just running into a brick wall. But I guess change is coming no matter how much you ignore reality. Anyways, I always love reading your books, so I'll leave a link in the description, and I can't recommend The Lost Piece enough to anyone listening. So yeah, thanks again for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.